The blue lights strobe against the quiet suburban dark, painting my neighbors' lawns in flashes of red and panic. My name is Valerie Chapman, and I am standing on my own front porch watching the police escort my parents away. For 30 years, I was the invisible child, the one expected to sacrifice my comfort so my brother could shine. But when they sold their future to fund his gambling and came for my home to pay the debt, I had to make a choice. Tonight, the daughter who always handled it finally decided to handle them. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. By the time my dad tried to move into my house like he owned it, I'd already learned one brutal truth: in this family I was the sacrifice. I stood on my front porch, the cold night air biting at my cheeks, watching the red and blue strobe of police lights wash over my quiet suburban street. Neighbors were peeking out from behind their curtains, watching the spectacle, but for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the reputation my father had spent his whole life manicuring. I just felt a hollow, vibrating silence where my loyalty used to be. To understand why I was standing there while officers spoke to my parents, you have to understand that this didn't start with a fight over a house. It started decades ago. In the quiet, insidious way, I was erased from my own family narrative. I grew up in a standard middle-class bubble, the kind where the lawns are perfect and the expectations are heavy. My dad, Thomas Chapman, was a blue-collar guy who grinded his way into owning a small contracting business. He was obsessed with the appearance of success, terrified of ever looking like he was struggling. My mom, Linda, was his shadow, anxious, a chronic peacemaker trained to nod along with whatever Thomas decided. And then there was Ryan, my older brother, the golden boy. In my dad's eyes, Ryan was the future CEO, the varsity athlete, the protagonist of the Chapman family movie. I was just the supporting character who moved the plot along. The dynamic was so consistent, it became background noise. When Ryan turned 16, there was a driveway ceremony for his car, a reliable sedan my dad had picked out personally. When I turned 16, Dad tossed a bus schedule and a book on personal finance onto the kitchen table. "You're independent, Val," he told me, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "You don't need a handout, you'll figure it out." It happened with grades, too. Ryan would bring home a B-, and we'd go out for steak to celebrate his potential. I'd bring home straight A's, and my dad would barely look up from his paper. "Good job," he'd mumble. "But don't overachieve just to prove something. Ryan's got the natural hustle. You work hard because you have to." That was his favorite line, the one that played on a loop in my head for 20 years. Your brother is the investment. You're the one who'll land on her feet. You can handle it. I learned to handle it, but I also learned that handling it really meant being sacrificed. I remember being 15 and getting accepted onto a school trip to DC. I'd saved allowance for months. 2 weeks before the deposit was due, my parents sat me down. Ryan had a chance to go to an elite sports camp. It was expensive. They needed my trip money. "It's for his recruitment, Valerie," Mom had said, her eyes pleading. "You understand, don't you? You can go to DC anytime." I didn't go. And when college came, the pattern cemented itself. Ryan's tuition was fully covered by the business. Me, I worked 3 part-time jobs, balancing trays and shelving books while studying, racking up loans they swore they couldn't help with. Every time they chose him, it felt like they were quietly trying to erase me, gambling everything on Ryan, while I was just the insurance policy they hoped they'd never have to pay out on. Fast forward to my late 20s. I had built a life that had nothing to do with them. I was an occupational therapist, a job centered on helping people rebuild independence. I lived in a mid-sized city far enough away to breathe. I had paid off my own loans. I had scraped together a down payment for a duplex, my pride and joy. I lived in the upstairs unit, and I rented the downstairs to a young couple, Jordan and Mia Lewis. They were sweet, responsible kids just starting out, and they had become part of my little community. I had Matt, a firefighter who was as grounded as my family was chaotic. We talked about marriage, about kids, about building a home that didn't feel like a competition. This duplex, my job, my relationship, this was the kingdom I built, because no one gave me one. Then came the phone call that shattered the peace. It was a Tuesday evening. My parents called, their voices bubbling with an excitement I hadn't heard in years. "We did it, Val," my dad announced. "We sold the house." I felt a surge of relief. They were downsizing. Maybe they'd finally have enough money to retire, to stop stressing, to maybe treat us equally. "That's amazing," I said, envisioning them traveling or gardening. "It went for way over asking," Dad continued, pride dripping from his voice. "So we made a decision. We gave the proceeds to Ryan." I froze. "What?" "It's seed money," he said, as if it were obvious. "For his new tech venture, and a down payment on a luxury condo downtown. He needs to look the part to get investors, Val. This is his big break." Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Gone. Handed to the golden boy for a startup that didn't exist yet. But before I could even process the injustice, my mother chimed in, her voice light and airy. "And since the house is sold, we'll just move into your downstairs unit for a while. You know, until we settle on where to go next." My blood ran cold. "Mom, I have tenants. Jordan and Mia live there." "Oh, just tell them to leave," Dad said, his voice dropping to that command tone he used on job sites. "Give them notice. We're family. Family comes first." The line went silent. My heart slammed against my ribs. I looked at Matt across the room, seeing the safety of the life I'd built, and I realized with terrifying clarity that my parents were willing to burn my life to the ground to keep Ryan warm. The silence after the phone call felt physical, like the air had been sucked out of the room. It wasn't just shock. It was the sickening sensation of being ambushed in my own life. I sat on the edge of the sofa, phone still in my hand, processing the arithmetic of what had just happened. My parents had liquidated their security to fund Ryan's vanity project, and now they were collecting the debt from me. They expected me to pay the price for their gamble by throwing out good tenants and disrupting my livelihood. Matt, usually the calmest man I knew, was pacing the living room, his face flushed with a rare protective fury. "They didn't just forget you, Val," he said, stopping to look at me. "They're acting like your work, your home, your stability. It's all just spare parts they can strip off to keep Ryan's machine running. It's sick." He was right. I took a breath, steeling myself, and called them back. I needed to set the first clear boundary of my adult life. When my dad answered, I didn't let him steamroll me. I spoke calmly. "Dad, I can't do that. Jordan and Mia have a valid lease. There are housing laws. I can't just kick them out because you gave your money to Ryan. They're a young couple starting out, exactly the kind of people you say you respect." The line went icy. "Stop being dramatic, Valerie," he snapped, his voice dripping with dismissal. "Leases are just paper. You're the landlord. You handle it. You're single, you have no kids, and you have a good job. You can sleep on a couch for a few months if you have to. Your brother's future is on the line here." The rage that hit me was blinding. It wasn't just the entitlement. It was the erasure. In his eyes, I thought, my entire life boils down to, "she'll manage." I refused again, harder this time, and hung up. That refusal triggered a siege. Over the next 3 days, my phone became a weapon. It started with Mom weeping into voicemails about how I was breaking my father's heart and how family helps family. Then came the flying monkeys. Aunt Cindy, Uncle Rob, Cousin Emily. People who hadn't called me in a year were suddenly texting me paragraphs of guilt. They all read from the same script. "You're the strong one, Val. Help them. Don't be selfish." The entire family system was wired to threaten me with guilt the moment I stepped out of my role as the silent fixer. It wasn't just my parents. It was a whole chorus of people willing to erase me if it kept the golden boy shining. Then the war moved from my phone to my front lawn. I was at the clinic reviewing a patient's file when my phone buzzed with frantic texts from Jordan. "Val, there's an older couple at the door with suitcases. They're pounding on the glass. They say they're your parents and they're trying to force their way in. Mia is scared." My stomach dropped through the floor. I typed back, "Do not open the door. Keep it locked. I'm coming." I called Matt, told him to meet me there, and raced out of the office. When I pulled up to the duplex, the scene was like a car wreck I couldn't look away from. My parents were standing on the porch, surrounded by suitcases and grocery bags, looking like they were checking into a hotel. My dad was banging his fist on the door, while my mom stood by sobbing loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, playing the victim for an audience of invisible judges. I slammed my car door and marched up the walk. "What are you doing?" I shouted. Dad spun around, his face red. "This is family property, Valerie, open. This door, those strangers are in there and your mother is out here in the heat." "This is not family property," I said, stepping between him and the door, my voice shaking but loud. "This is my house. These are my tenants. You don't get to just show up and take what you want because you made a bad financial decision." After everything we sacrificed, he stepped into my space using his physical size to intimidate me, a tactic that used to work when I was 12. "This is how you treat your parents. We raised you. If you don't get off this porch," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm, "Jordan and Mia are going to call the police. I told them to. Do you want the neighbors to see that?" The threat of public humiliation, the only thing my father feared more than failure, froze him. He glared at me with pure venom, grabbed his suitcase, and signaled Mom to the car. They left, furious and humiliated, tires screeching as they peeled away. But the retreat was only physical. That night, the family group chats turned poisonous. My phone lit up with notifications I was too nauseous to read, but the previews were enough. "Your parents are practically homeless and you slam the door in their faces. How can you abandon family? Selfish." Not one person asked about the tenants. Not one person asked about the law. It was a deliberate smear campaign, a family-wide effort to strip me of my reputation, until I complied. I lay in bed that night, Matt's arm heavy and comforting across my chest, staring at the ceiling. "I think my dad would rather erase me from the family story completely," I whispered, "then admit he chose wrong." I sat up, grabbed my laptop, and opened a blank email draft. My cursor blinked against the white screen, a steady rhythmic pulse. I had a choice: stay silent and let them destroy my name, or burn the bridge to save myself. I started typing. The blinking cursor on my screen felt like a ticking bomb, but for the first time, I was the one holding the detonator. I didn't write a diatribe. I didn't use all caps or scream about fairness. I simply wrote the truth, stripped of all the family mythology my father loved so much. I listed the timeline of my parents selling their home. I detailed the exact amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, they had handed over to Ryan just 2 weeks ago. I attached a PDF of Jordan and Mia's valid legal lease, proving I couldn't just kick them out. And finally, I described the scene on my porch, my father pounding on the door, trying to force his way into a stranger's home, while my mother screamed to the neighbors. I typed one final line: "If any of you believe my parents deserve housing more than my tenants do, please reply all with your address so they can move into your spare room immediately." I hit send. The silence that followed was deafening. The group chat, usually buzzing with accusations, went dead. For a moment, I felt a surge of terror. I had just nuked the bridge, but that terror was quickly replaced by a strange, intoxicating power. I had broken the code of silence. The cracks in the Golden Boy's image started showing almost immediately. Later that afternoon, my cousin Emily, the only relative who hadn't joined the mob, called me in a hush. She had done some digging. "Val, it's bad," she whispered. "Ryan's tech venture. The bank already denied his business loan. He has no revenue. And the luxury condo, the deal is falling apart because he can't prove income. The down payment your parents gave him, it might be gone if he defaults on the contract." The pieces clicked into a grotesque picture. My dad's pride in Ryan wasn't just favoritism, it was a reckless gamble with the family's entire existence. He had bet the farm on a horse with a broken leg, and now that the bet was failing, he was trying to cannibalize my life to patch the hole. Then Ryan called. I expected an apology, or at least humility. Instead, his voice was tight, irritated. "Val, you need to fix this," he said, skipping a greeting. "Mom and Dad are freaking out. Look, I just need a bridge loan. If you can float me 20,000, I can save the deposit on the wedding venue and keep things moving. Once the business launches, I'll pay you back with interest." I nearly laughed out loud. He truly believed it was the natural order of the world. His parents gave him everything, and I was the backup generator sitting silently in the dark until the main power failed. He didn't see me as a person, he saw me as a resource. "No," I said, my voice steady. "What do you mean, no?" Ryan snapped, his veneer of cool CEO cracking. "You're going to regret this. You're tearing the family apart over money you clearly have." "I'm not tearing anything apart, Ryan. I'm just refusing to pay for the wreckage you caused." I hung up. I realized then that he wasn't just benefiting from the system, he was its most active defender. 2 days passed in relative quiet. I thought the worst was over. Then came Saturday morning. Matt and I were having coffee, enjoying the rare sunlight streaming into our living room. My living room upstairs, separate from the rental unit. We were talking about baby names, a hypothetical future that felt warm and safe. Then the doorbell rang. Once. Twice. Then a relentless staccato pounding. I pulled up the Ring camera feed on my phone. My stomach turned over. It was them. My parents. But they weren't screaming this time. They were dressed in their Sunday best. Mom was holding a bouquet of flowers. Dad was holding grocery bags. They looked like they were arriving for a pleasant family dinner. "Sweetheart," Mom's voice cooed through the speaker, sugary and terrifying. "We know you're home. Let us in. We brought the ingredients for your favorite roast. Let's just sit down and eat." "We've had time to reflect," Dad added, staring directly into the lens. "Let's talk like adults." Matt stood up, his jaw set, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't open it," I whispered. "This isn't an apology. It's a tactic." I knew exactly what this was. If they got inside, they would never leave. They would occupy the space emotionally and physically until I broke. It was a siege disguised as a visit. "I'm not opening the door," I said through the intercom app. "Please leave." The mask slipped instantly. Dad's face contorted. "If you don't let us in, we are not leaving, Valerie. You do not treat your father this way. Think about your future family," Mom wailed, shifting from sugar to acid in a split second. "Don't you want your parents involved? Do you want your children to know you abandoned us?" I looked at Matt. I looked at the walls of the home I paid for. I realized this was the defining moment of my life. If I opened that door, I was accepting my role as the sacrifice forever. If I kept it closed, I was an orphan. I picked up my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. My voice was calm, almost detached. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespass in progress. I have 2 individuals refusing to leave my property. They've attempted forced entry before." Watching the police cruiser roll up on the camera feed felt like an out-of-body experience. I saw the officers approach. I saw my father gesture wildly, trying to explain his rights to my house. I saw the officer shake his head and point toward their car. Dad looked up at the camera one last time, his eyes burning with a hatred I had never seen before. "You'll regret this, Valerie," he mouthed. As their car pulled away, escorted by the police, the silence returned to my living room. I sat back on the couch, my hands trembling. Something inside me had just broken the tether of guilt, the wire of obligation, but it didn't break me. It set me free. Calling the police on my parents was the line of no return, and I knew I had to fortify it immediately. The next morning, I didn't wait for the guilt to set in. I drove straight to the legal aid clinic to see Danielle Price, an old friend from college who specialized in housing and family law. Sitting in her cramped office surrounded by stacks of case files, I felt a strange mixture of shame and necessity. I explained everything: the attempted entry, the harassment, the threats. Danielle didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with professional resolve. Together we drafted a formal cease and desist letter. The language was cold, precise, and absolute. No trespassing, no unauthorized visits to my home or my rental property, and a clear warning that any further harassment would be documented and pursued in court. I sent it via certified mail to their new address, a location I only had because my cousin Emily had quietly texted it to me along with a stay strong emoji that meant more than she probably knew. While the legal paperwork created a blast shield between me and my biological relatives, something remarkable began to happen in my immediate world. The vacuum left by my family was instantly filled by the community I had built. Jordan and Mia, the tenants I had fought to protect, showed up at my door, not with demands, but with a tray of homemade lasagna and tearful thanks. We didn't know if anyone would actually stick up for us against their own parents, Jordan told me. Neighbors who had witnessed the police incident didn't gossip maliciously. They stopped me while I was walking to the car to offer support, checking if I was safe, validating that I had done the hard right thing. It forced me to redefine the word family. For 29 years, I thought family meant blood obligation, a debt you paid simply for being born. Now I realized family was whoever respected your boundaries and rooted for your freedom. It was a chosen community, based on mutual aid, not a hierarchy of sacrifice. Meanwhile, the fallout on the other side of town was swift and unforgiving. My truth email combined with the police report had done its work. The extended family faced with hard evidence of my parents' cruelty, and Ryan's financial house of cards began to quietly distance themselves. No one wanted to be collateral damage in Thomas Chapman's failed investments. Through the grapevine, I learned that Ryan's luxury condo deal had officially imploded. Without the additional bailout he tried to squeeze out of me, he couldn't cover the closing costs or the wedding venue deposit. He ended up losing the down payment, my parents' retirement money, and had to move into a cramped apartment with his fiancée, who was reportedly furious. The irony was staggering. My parents had sacrificed their home, their security, and their daughter to launch Ryan into the stratosphere, and they had all crash-landed in a one-bedroom rental on the edge of town. Yet even in the wreckage, they refused to look at the flight plan. They still wanted me to fix it. A few weeks later, the letters arrived. They were private attempts at reconciliation, or what they considered reconciliation, which was really just a bid for renewed control. My mother's letter was a masterclass in passive-aggressive gaslighting. "We're so sorry if you felt ambushed," she wrote in shaky cursive. "We only did what any loving parents would do to help their son. You didn't have to involve the police, Valerie. You made us look like abusers to the whole neighborhood." My father's note was shorter and colder. He refused to apologize. "You turned a private family matter into a legal issue," he scrawled. "You've forgotten what parents deserve after a lifetime of raising you." Reading those letters at my kitchen table, I waited for the old familiar crush of shame, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a profound sense of grief mixed with clarity. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They were asking me to undo the boundary. They wanted me to pretend the abuse hadn't happened, so they could return to the comfortable delusion that they were good parents. I processed this shift with Matt and my therapist over the next month. We unpacked the realization that my father's lifelong pattern praising Ryan, diminishing me, treating me as the strong one who didn't need care, was never actually a commentary on my worth. It was a commentary on his own ego and fear. He needed Ryan to be the success story to validate his own life, and he needed me to be the silent utility worker who kept the lights on. One evening, I looked around my peaceful duplex. I heard Jordan and Mia laughing downstairs. I saw Matt reading on the couch. I realized that for the first time, my life was actually mine. It wasn't a resource my parents could tap when their bad bets went south. I sat down at my computer, the same place where I had sent the email that started the war, and I opened a new document. I wasn't done fighting, but I was done fighting in the dark. I decided then and there to speak my story publicly, not to humiliate them, but to reclaim the narrative completely, and maybe help someone else who was being told they could handle it. I sat in front of the microphone, the red recording light glowing like a steady, unblinking eye. I had decided to tell the truth not just to a lawyer or a police officer, but to the world. I recorded a long-form story, stripping away the specific names, but leaving the raw, jagged emotions intact. I spoke about the ambush, the feeling of being sacrificed, and the way a family can try to erase a child to keep a golden image shiny. I described the financial abuse, the weaponization of guilt, and the specific pain of being the child who was always told she could handle it. When I uploaded the episode, I expected backlash. Instead, I found a chorus. Comments flooded in from strangers who had been the backup plan in their own families, people who had been cannibalized to feed a sibling's ego. Reading their words, I felt a powerful shift. The isolation my parents had tried to impose on me shattered. I wasn't an ungrateful daughter. I was part of a vast, invisible community of survivors. This clarity helped me reframe my idea of revenge. True revenge wasn't about destroying my parents or Ryan. It was about ensuring they could never dictate the terms of my existence again. I met with a lawyer to update my will, a grim but necessary task. I removed my family entirely as beneficiaries, ensuring that if anything happened to me, my assets, my hard-earned home, my savings would go to Matt and a local charity that supported foster youth. It was a legal severing of the final cord. I also began mentoring younger women in my field, teaching them about financial literacy and the power of no. And I started a small monthly support circle for people dealing with toxic family expectations. I was turning my scar tissue into armor for others. Months later, I agreed to meet my parents one last time. I chose the venue carefully, a busy diner on neutral ground in the middle of the day. I walked in not as a trembling daughter seeking approval, but as an adult woman with nothing left to lose. They were already seated in a booth, looking smaller and older than I remembered. The air between us was thick with unsaid things. "We just want to put this behind us." My dad started skipping the pleasantries. He looked tired, his bluster replaced by a weary agitation. "We did what we had to do as parents, Valerie. You have to understand that." I set my menu down and looked him in the eye. "No," I said, my voice steady enough to cut glass. "You didn't do what you had to do as parents. You did what you wanted to do as Ryan's parents. You gambled your home, and when you lost, you threatened and shamed me because I wouldn't cover your losses. That isn't love, Dad. That's entitlement." My mother touched my hand, her eyes swimming with tears. "Why are you being so cold?" she whispered. "We're your family." I pulled my hand back gently. "This isn't cold, Mom. This is just me refusing to let you erase me to keep Dad's ego comfortable. I'm not the backup plan anymore." I didn't wait for the argument to spiral. I placed a $20 bill on the table for my coffee, stood up, and walked out. I didn't look back to see if they were angry or crying. For the first time in my life, their reaction was not my responsibility. The real healing, however, happened back at the duplex. That weekend, Matt and I decided to finally paint the spare room. We chose a soft sage green, turning it into a hybrid space, part creative studio, part future nursery. As we rolled the paint onto the walls, covering the old stale beige, I felt like I was reclaiming the physical space of my life. Later that afternoon, Jordan and Mia came out to the backyard. Together, the four of us dug a hole in the corner of the lot and planted a young oak tree. It was a small thing, but symbolic. It represented roots that I had chosen, roots that would grow deep and strong without poisoning the soil around them. My house felt different now. It wasn't just a structure of wood and brick anymore. It was a fortress made of intention. As the sun went down, I stood on the back porch looking at the fresh dirt around the sapling. I thought about the arc of my life, the little girl who was always overlooked, the young woman who was trained to give up everything because she was strong enough to take the hit, and the adult who finally terrifyingly said no. My parents would likely never see their actions as wrong. My dad would probably go to his grave praising my brother's potential while resenting my independence. But I realized that was their story to tell, not mine. They didn't get to write my ending anymore. They had tried to erase me to keep a fantasy intact. But in the end, all they erased was their place in my life. I turned back toward the sliding glass door, where Matt was laughing at something Jordan said in the kitchen. "My family is the one I'm building now. A home shaped by love, not obligation, by boundaries, not fear. That is the legacy I choose." Valerie finally found peace by building her own legacy, proving that sometimes the strongest family is the one you choose yourself. If you enjoyed this story of reclaiming independence, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Let us know below, do you think Valerie was right to call the police on her parents? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.